too. So great to have you there too. And everyone else that's in the comments. Okay. Hello, everyone. And yes, we had a little technical issue. I can already see in the comments, no sound Lambertus. But hopefully now you can hear me. And we're very excited. I think this is our 7th live stream. And it's great to see all of you here already. Imre, I can see you here. BGC, I can see you there. I've seen you in all of the live streams we've done so far. So great to have you here again. And remember, this is an interactive live stream. So questions, argue, whatever you want. Everything is possible here. And today we have an awesome topic. So as you know, in the last 2 weeks, there's been a Ukraine invasion into Kursk, which is in Russia, of course. And this is a big development in the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're going to dive right into it after I introduce my guest, which I'll get to in a minute. The next topic we have is the Nord Stream pipeline that we're going to talk about. There's some new developments there. And then lastly, we're going to look at NATO a little bit and the EU, and also drone warfare, which is an interesting little nugget at the end of the live stream. And I am joined today by an amazing guest. We're very, very excited to have him on. It's Patrick Bolder, and he's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Royal Netherlands Air Force. And he's also a strategic advisor for defense and security at the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies. Sorry, I had to look quickly how the university was called again. But Patrick, amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Lambertus. Yeah, no problem. I'm glad to be on this channel and explain a little for a very well-informed public already, I guess, but always good to tell some more and give some background to recent developments.
Yeah, because I mean, you are pretty much an expert on the topic. If I'm not misunderstanding, you have a book that you have not co-authored, but you've written a couple of chapters, right, on this exact issue. Is that correct? Maybe you want to show the public.
Yeah, well, it's a book which is being published by the Netherlands Defense Academy, or edited by the Netherlands Defense Academy, and I've written one of the chapters within that together with Professor Dr. Lonneke Peperkamp, and it's about the use of the space domain during the Ukraine-Russia war as of February 2022.
Right.
How is the space domain being used by both parties, but especially what are the new things there? What can we learn from it? And well, best conclusion, space is there to stay, especially in warfare.
Yeah.
I recommend the chapter. It's about 20 pages. It's easy reading, and it's I think it's enlightening as well.
Great. We need to make sure that we link the book at the in the video. Sure. Yeah. So we'll do that. We'll do that during this stream. So let's, without further ado, Patrick, I would love to go into the details with you because we have 45 minutes. It's not too long to discuss such a complex topic. And I have a map in front of me. So as you can tell, everyone, this is Ukraine. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And here we have a small blue area. And for anyone that's been living under a rock, what's happened since August the 6th, Ukraine has, well, I mean, I guess invaded Russia. A small part, as you can see here on the map. And Patrick, my first question is, what are your thoughts? Was this expected, or what are your thoughts about this whole debacle?
Yeah, well, no, it certainly wasn't expected, and it was conducted and conceived under the greatest secrecy because, well, everything you say and tell and plan with your partners, your international partners, will leak out anyhow. And we know that within the American establishment, the ties with the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal are very close. So any nugget of information can just fly over into the public domain. So the Ukrainian military staff and the presidency himself, they were involved in the planning of this operation, and nobody else. They kept a close lid on it. Well, and that's logical, of course, because the main issue to make sure your opponent is on the wrong footing is by surprising him. And it really was a surprise also for me, but also an understandable surprise, because we saw that the frontal areas in the east and in the south of Ukraine, nothing really much happened. There was a lot of fighting, but mainly static fighting, trench warfare for almost 2 years already, or for already 2 years even. And Ukraine was gradually losing a little bit of terrain. Russia was gradually winning a little bit of terrain, a football
Right.
field each day or something like that, at tremendous cost, by the way. So something new had to happen in order to give Ukraine new chances, to make sure that the Ukrainians themselves believed this war could turn around in their favor. And such an incursion into Russian area, that was something, well, nobody really expected. And it really turned the dynamics in favor of Ukraine. And that's what we see. You can think about what are the goals Ukraine wants to reach with that. Well, first of all, of course, it's surprise. It's slapping Putin in the face. Putin is saying he must keep Russia safe by invading Ukraine and by creating a buffer zone in Ukraine. I'm sorry about that.
No problem, no problem.
Creating a buffer zone in Ukraine.
Yeah.
In order to keep Sumy area safe.
And the Sumy area is right here, right?
Yeah,
let's just
for people south of the incursion area.
Yeah. So everyone, this is Sumy, and here is the buffer zone.
That's, they call it Oblast, which is another name for province. So two goals already: making sure that the Russian public sees that Putin is not the strong leader he pretends to be. He cannot keep Russia safe. It's creating a buffer zone, but also, in order to get the Ukrainians out, the Russian army has to deploy other units in order to fight back. And these other units have to come somewhere from. Well, almost 100% of Russian army is involved with the war in the east and in the south of Ukraine. So those units have to move from the active zones in the war towards Kursk and Bryansk and Belgorod region in order to fight the Ukrainians back. And that means there's less pressure on the frontal areas. We don't see that yet, but probably in 2 weeks we can see that, because those units pulled away there are not the units who are currently fighting with the Ukrainians.
Right.
These are the follow-on units. So when the first units, which are now fighting, first Russian units now fighting, are getting tired, are getting depleted of their men and means, the follow-on forces should come. But if those follow-on forces go all the way back to the Kursk area, they can't take over the fight.
Right.
And in the meantime, whilst they're on the move, they can also not join the fight. So we see a gradual decrease of the active fighting able formations of Russia.
Patrick, maybe if I could just challenge like a little bit of this, because it seems like a good move, but isn't it dangerous to tickle the bear, so to speak? Because I mean, it is Russia we're talking about, and it is a nuclear power. And I mean, do you see a big risk here? Because I see a big risk, I guess.
Well, the first risk is, of course, if this Ukrainian incursion would go wrong, they suffer a lot of losses in men and in material, and they have less in order to defend themselves. If the Russians don't react to it, the Ukrainian forces are deployed in another area than from where they can support their offensive against the Russians. They fight against the Russians in order to push them out of their own country. And yeah, sure, it's also, but that's the mean. Ukrainian forces are now also editing on internet that they are looking for Russian red lines. But after, what's it now, 2.5 weeks almost, they haven't found any red lines on the Russian side yet. So, and they keep looking, and they go further looking. And that says, well, you're absolutely right, because an invasion into the Russian area might trigger, within the nuclear doctrine of Russia, to answer with nuclear weapons. But we haven't seen that. So all these claims, which have been made already 2 years by the Russians about Western aid, which would trigger probably a nuclear war, or the delivery of the tanks, or the delivery of the F-16s.
Right.
It's always big talk, but no action. So,
but in your expertise, right? I mean, you're let's say definitely compared to me, you're a massive military expert. Is there red lines? Is there a point you think that it could happen where Russia does? I mean, I guess press the button is a stupid analogy, but you know what I mean. Is there red lines? Do you believe?
It's becoming less and less clear. if there's a red line concerning the use of nuclear weapons.
Right.
Probably Russia will refrain from using them because they were put under big pressure by the Indian president, by the Chinese president, which is really who has really a big influence on Putin, and also by the Americans. They already said in an early stage of the war that if you start with nuclear weapons, we will destroy Russia, and not probably in a nuclear weapons way, but in a cyber domain, in the electronic warfare domain, putting out all the lights and all over Russia by cyber warfare. And that's possible. The Americans then can do that also with the support of other NATO nations. So the use of nuclear weapons, you can't rule it out, but
it's unlikely.
Threshold is very high to do that, much higher than this incursion is or the delivery of weapon systems is.
Right.
Maybe if Ukraine would go all the way to Kursk, take the nuclear reactor, or march all the way up to Moscow, then things will change. But I think Kursk is not important enough for Putin to put nuclear weapons out there.
So Patrick, imagine we're sitting again here in 4 weeks. Do you think this map will change? Will there be more blue here for Ukraine? Will there be less? What's your prediction, if I might ask?
The shape will probably be different. If you look at the blue zone and you see the river to the west, currently the Ukrainians damaged quite a few bridges over the Sime River.
Yeah.
And if you damage those bridges, the Russian forces are trapped between the river and the Russia-Ukraine border in that area. So that makes it easier defendable for the Ukrainians. And if they want to hold on to the terrain and have it as a bargaining chip in future negotiations, that would probably be a very interesting part of Russia to keep hold of, because it's easier defendable behind the river.
Yeah.
It's not extending your own logistical lines all too big. If you go back to the east a little, you see that the extension of the incursion is up to 35 kilometers to the north. That means you have a very long
supply
flank on your sides. You have to defend it, but also internally you have very long logistical lines, and you have to maintain the fighting force by keeping ammunitions, by keeping fuel, by keeping food, by keeping men at a high level. So that asks a lot of the whole logistical system. And so two things: you want to keep yourself safe, you don't want to lose too much man and material, and so you have to defend yourself. And if you want to keep hold on that, you find the best defendable position, and probably that's between the border and the river.
Super interesting. Next question is, before I go to the chat, last question before I go to questions from the chat. So the EU, right? What does this mean? Because we are an EU channel. What does this mean for the EU? Because last year, there has been skepticism for more and more parties across the EU around sending money, military aid, things like that to Ukraine. Do you think this incursion at this point in time, I know things can change, will improve that? Or will do the opposite, where the opposing parties get even stronger because now all of a sudden we're attacking Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah. No, I think everybody can see now that the dynamic has changed. Ukraine is not only the party gradually losing more terrain and thus losing the war, but Ukraine shows, first of all, that they, with the right weapons, with enough money, with enough men, they can really change the outcome of the war. At least the first signals are probably there. But also that means that every support, they prove actually that every support from the EU and from Western partners is very helpful in maintaining Ukraine's position and maintaining Ukraine as a free and hopefully democratic country, which would fit into the European Union, and being part of the European Union would enhance the security of Ukraine as well. So I think this demonstration that also the red lines of Putin are still further up north, so we can do what we have to do in order to support Ukraine, and might embolden again the support which is there for Ukraine.
Okay, then thanks for the answer. Let me quickly go to the chat. So firstly, thank you, Black Hole, and thank you, Super Terra, for your support. Appreciate your super comments. And they're thanking us for an awesome guest. So Patrick, there's a little compliment for you too.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Imre. Can you explain, Patrick, what is happening in the air above Ukraine? Why don't we see two air forces clash? Are the SAM systems so powerful on both sides? And why are the F-16s and where are the F-16s and Su-57s? This guy's knowledgeable. I hope you understand the question.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
What we've seen over the whole war actually is that there's no favorable air situation for either side, and that's why Russia used the tactic of the dive bombs or the glide bombs, as we call them. You can throw them from the aircraft 40 to 7 kilometers behind the front, so on your own terrain, above your own country, and then they will glide into the opponent's country. So 50 kilometers within Russia, you release the bomb from very high altitude, and it will fly 60 to 70 kilometers and will explode on the Ukrainian area, front troops, hospitals, whatever. So that's because both parties maintain a favorable air situation over their own terrain. That means it's very dangerous to fly with your fast jets over the opponent's terrain. We see now, especially in targeting the bridges we just talked about, that it looks like they were attacked by aircraft, by Ukrainian aircraft.
Oh, wait, okay.
And that means that Ukraine brought their own air defense systems with them during this incursion in order to keep the Russian Air Force at a distance. So they created a temporarily and locally air superiority in the area they're operating, and then you can operate with your own aircraft there.
Oh, wow, okay.
The Sukhoi 57 is still very limited in numbers. It's questionable if it's really an effective aircraft. Russians boast about it, but we haven't seen it in action, and because it's very rare, the Russians don't risk to put it into operations. The F-16s on the Ukrainian side, I don't think many Ukrainian pilots are already trained for the F-16. There are not many F-16s, and first of all, I think the F-16s will be used in an air defense role, plugging the gaps in the static air defense systems, in the ground-based air defense systems within Ukraine itself, in order to shoot down cruise missiles and drones, which are bypassing the ground-based air defense systems. Ukrainians have a lot to learn in the F-16, have to learn how to support the ground troops, have to learn how to do aerial combat. And I think over time, when they're better equipped, when they're better trained, more familiar with the F-16 and the Russian air situation, the air defense situation is degraded further, then we can see the F-16s more in an offensive role, but not at the moment.
Interesting. Thank you for the question.
It's quite technical. I hope the audience understands.
It is technical. I think so. You're getting we're getting lots of new questions, but let us know if that answered your question in the chat. I will go to another point because I know you're one of your specialties is drone warfare too. So maybe we start there. Drone warfare in Ukraine and Russia. Has there been an evolution in drone warfare? I mean, we haven't seen that in the past, have we? Or what's your opinion on that? Yeah.
Drones are already very old, but they were only in a reconnaissance role until shortly. In the fall of 2020, there was a 5-week war in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azerbaijanis fought the Armenians over a lot of territory in Nagorno-Karabakh. And there we could see the first use of drones integrated in the traditional armed forces. And I think that was the turning point, really. There was an evolution, as you rightly say, about the use of drones, and now it's more or less exploded. Nobody can do without drones anymore. And because it's a new system, we're still struggling how to defend against drones. Both sides are. The costs for defense are 10 times higher than the means themselves. If you want to down a drone, a Shahed drone, and you use a rocket system for that, the rocket system is at least 5 or 6 times as expensive as Shahed drones. And those Shahed drones, they come in the thousands. I think Colonel General Syrskyi from the Ukrainian General Staff he reported yesterday there were almost 14,000 Shahed drones fired at Ukraine by Russia. We have to look at new weapons to defend against drones, better radars, better command and control, better warnings, cheaper weapons like high energy lasers, like electromagnetic pulse weapons in order to counter drones. And if we see that the countermeasures are becoming cheaper than the drones themselves, then we've got a new situation, but we're not there yet.
Okay.
And so drones are being used as a throwaway item, actually, as a throwaway weapon. And probably Ukraine is now the biggest drone producer in the world.
Didn't know that. That's yeah, but makes sense, right? Because they're in full military.
And if you have a drone which can do a lot of tasks which would normally be done by people, by soldiers, you would be stupid in order to deploy the soldier to do that task and expose him to danger. If you can have a drone to do that, I always say it's unethical to send a soldier to do something for which you can use an unmanned system. Because you have to spare your lives. And as Ukraine, the country itself is 15 times the size of the Netherlands. There's 44 million inhabitants, whilst Russia is 11 time zones big and has 140 million inhabitants. You know, the scale, the dimensions of the manpower are so different and so divergent from each other that Ukraine has to spare every man and woman they have in order to make sure they can maintain themselves against the Russian aggression.
Yeah. We got some more questions. There's quite a few in the chat. There was an interesting one, I thought, which is, will there ever be peace? And that also leads to another question, which is, can even this current power in the Kremlin ever give up unless overthrown? So I think you can work with that.
Yeah. Can there ever be peace? Well, let's hope so, I would say. But it should be a just peace. And what is a just peace? It's a peace where both parties have their right and are happy with, more or less, and they both have to give in. But when both parties say, okay, this is the best we can reach at the moment. But at the moment, well, with the successful Ukrainian incursion in Russia, President Zelensky thinks, I still got a lot to win. And President Putin thinks, I can win because I've got the stamina to maintain this battle for a long time. I've got bigger stamina than the West, which supports Ukraine. So as long as these very divergent views on the future of this war are still present, there won't be a peace. There won't even be talks about peace. Well, Ukraine is in the process of organizing a peace conference in the end of this year, but it's questionable if Russia will join. They are invited, but will they join? If they don't join, well, it will never be a success, of course. And Putin states that, okay, we can have a peace if you give the 4 provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, to me. You decrease your armed forces tremendously, and you promise never to be a member of NATO. But that's not realistic. That's not realistic because that would mean that Ukraine will be falling into the hands of Russia, will not be defendable anymore, will not be viable as a state anymore. And don't forget, from those 4 provinces, those 4 oblasts, neither one is completely in the hands of Putin, especially Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast are only partly in the hands of Putin. So these demands are unrealistic. And now that the Kursk invasion has taken place, even the Kremlin representative in the United Nations stated that, well, the very generous offer we gave to Ukraine, the points I just mentioned, is now off the table. And that means, well, it's only diverging further and further. So will there be peace? We should strive for peace, but it should be a just peace, but not in the near future, I'm afraid.
But to really, to push you a little bit on this, do you think it's possible with Putin? Do you think it's possible with a leader like that in the Kremlin, or does something need to happen before we can even think about peace, making peace?
Yeah, that's the follow-on question you asked.
Yeah.
Probably we need such a shock in the system in order to have someone else there who can say, okay, enough of this madness, and we have to come to our senses with Ukraine and see what we can hold on to in order to maintain a stable situation. But Ukraine will always ask for security and defense guarantees, and they don't trust Russia anymore. And that's logical, because in 1991 and 1994, their borders were established. They were established as a sovereign country, and Russia again and again invaded Ukraine. First of all, in 2014 by taking Crimea, and now in 2022, but also in 2040 by helping the opposing forces in Donetsk and Luhansk. So there is absolutely no trust on the Ukrainian side in Putin and his whole Siloviki environment. So that must change quite a lot in the Kremlin before Zelensky will support a peace deal, and which will deliver probably some parts of Ukraine as it is at the moment.
That's, yeah. I expected an answer like that, which makes sense. Let me go to the chat again. There's a lot of questions, so thank you for the super chats. We'll prioritize those. So if you want your question answered, that's the best way to do it. Super Terra, thank you. So here's a question on the POWs. Actually, how big is the scale of Russian POWs captured by Ukraine? They are more politically important because they are conscripts, and there are many. Do you have an estimate there, or do you know anything about this?
Yeah. The last numbers I read were about 2,000 soldiers, and indeed, especially the conscripts, these are a pain in the neck for Putin, because conscripts, and that's within the German, in the Russian constitution, are not allowed to enter a war, and therefore we don't see conscripts in the wider Ukraine theater. Only if they sign contracts, which happens often, and they're being pushed to sign contracts. But conscripts are not allowed to take part in a war. Now they are in a war because Ukraine invaded part of Russia, where conscripts were there to guard the border, because Russia never thought that Ukraine would cross the border. And there's a very strong movement within Russia, the Mother of Conscripts organization or something like that. And they are powerful, and they already have raised their voices that how is it possible that Russia doesn't protect those boys in service of the motherland, and let them fall into the hands of Ukrainians. What we see, and I think it's not only propaganda, but there's a lot of truism in that, is that Ukraine is managing the POWs and taking care of the POWs according to the Geneva Conventions. While on the Russian side, well, we saw Russian Ukrainian POWs coming back from Russian captivity. They lost a lot of body mass, like up to 40 to 60 kilograms sometimes. They were nurtured, they were maltreated, they were subject to marteling. What's that in English?
Marteling, yeah, that's torture. Yeah.
They were subject to torture.
Yeah.
And even Russia tortures their own soldiers who don't want to fight, and they
I've seen videos. It's crazy.
So I think those conscripts are probably better off being in Ukrainian POW camps than within the Russian barracks.
Yeah. Sadly, it's really sad seeing. I mean, what's going on with human lives over there at the border? It's absolutely insane.
It's always the humans who suffer, the civilians, but also the soldiers being sent there with the wrong motives.
Right.
And that's what we saw from the start of the whole war in February 2022, when the Russian soldiers really thought that within 3 days they would be in Kiev and they would be welcomed with bread and salt, which is the Ukrainian way to say welcome to dear guests. But it turned out the other way completely.
I mean, that's one of the most surprising things at the war. I mean, me as a non-military expert, I thought when it started, it's days until Kiev falls, because it's Russia. You know, we always imagined it when we grew up anyway. When I grew up as a massive power.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think most analysts, myself also, the Russian bear is loose and is unstoppable, but the Russian army is the second strongest in Ukraine at the moment.
Right. It's a big statement. Yeah. Patrick, here is also a good question. And thank you, Villa, and thank you for being a Patreon. So he's asking how effective the EU, and let's focus on the EU, how effective the EU has been in supporting Ukraine, and have they done enough?
Oh, that's a good question. According to Zelensky, they're not doing enough in the right time. Things should be done in a quicker way, but that's how the EU works. Everybody knows that. It's the 27. They have to agree unanimously, and within those member states, well, some member states are less concerned about the Ukraine fate, like Hungary and Slovakian Republic at the moment. What's happening now with the confiscated Russian money within the EU and the revenues from that money, which will go to Ukraine, I think that's a very important step.
Right. It's 1.5 billion so far, I think, right, in euros. I mean, that will have to increase, but yeah.
Probably rising up to 5 billion a year or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
which is an important help. But the problem is that within the European Union, a lot of the member states have gone through tremendous decreases of their military systems and the military apparatus and the military capability over the past 30 years after the Iron Curtain ended and the Cold War ended. And that means that we have little stuff really to give Ukraine. And we have no industrial capacity to beef up quickly in order to give Ukraine the right weapons in the right time. And that's not so much that the EU doesn't want, but that's more that the EU isn't capable. And also the promise of Thierry Breton, the EU commissioner, that by the end of this year, there would be 1 million 155 millimeter grenades for the artillery systems that Ukraine has got donated by the West. We don't meet that target because there's no industrial capability in order to beef up so quickly. And that's just one weapon system. It's also about air defense system. It's about armored cars. It's about tanks. There's just too little left in the inventory of the European armies after 30 years of peace dividend, as we call it in the Netherlands, decreasing the armed forces, because we would never fight a war like this again in the European continent. But how different did it become?
Yeah. There's another topic. I'm moving topics now quickly to something else, which was very interesting and made the news. And that was, let me just quickly share this link so we can change. Here we go. Oh, no. Here we go.
Oh, yeah.
This also made the news recently, and I thought it'd be interesting to discuss with you too. And that is the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. So for everyone here, I mean, again, if you've been living under a rock, 2 years ago in 2022, the pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines, have been, well, there was explosions there on the pipelines, and they were partially destroyed. And it's been a big question mark who did this, right? There's been speculation it was the US, it was even Russia, Ukraine, no one knew. Loads of different players in this. And now there's this news that a Ukrainian man, apparently, at least that's what the allegation is, did this. Patrick, what is your opinion on this? Do you see this as a valid case or not?
Well, first of all the news concerning this pipeline and what was again in the Wall Street Journal this week or last week it was just reused again, revived again, because there's nothing new there. There's no new evidence. The only new thing is that the German judicial system now wants this probably Ukrainian man being handed over to Germany in order to put him through the system there. But there's nothing new there. And actually, if you think about it, the evidence that it was the Andromeda sailing yacht with 6 people on board who planted 3 bombs within the very cold and rough
Sorry to interrupt you, Patrick. Can you maybe explain that? I'm not sure the audience knows that. Like, what happened? Like, what's the allegation?
Well,
Yeah.
there was a research done by, I think it was the Germans, and they stated that 6 Ukrainian people, 5 guys and 1 woman, they rented in the harbor of Rostock in former Eastern Germany and the Baltic Sea harbor, a sailing yacht, Andromeda, is a very small yacht, and they used it. They sailed to Bornholm, the Danish island, close to where the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines are on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. And they also sailed to Sandem, which is in Sweden, and they sailed back to Bornholm. And allegedly there was traces of explosives found on that boat afterwards, and they more or less traced the rental of the boat back to Ukrainians. And so they said Ukrainians have planted the bombs at the Nord Stream pipelines, and they were behind it. But if you really do a good research, first of all, from such a small yacht, and also that was later done and repeated by the ARD in Germany, the Allgemeine Rundfunk Deutschland, there were people there who were trained divers, and they said, this is not a ship I would dive off anyway, especially not 70 or 80 meters deep, which is how deep the Baltic Sea is. You need to read special equipment. You need a lot of oxygen tanks. You need a decompression chamber. You need nitrogen in order to dive. And that just doesn't fit on the boat. A dive to 70 meters can only be done once a day by a very experienced diver. At the time, the sea was very cold as well, especially on 70 meters. So you have to dive in a dry suit. And in order to plant the explosives, you really have a crane aboard in order to let these explosives, about 50 to 60 kilograms down. You can't take that down as a diver because it will pull you so fast down, 50 kilos extra. It will just ruin you as a human being. So actually, practically, it's almost impossible to do that from that little ship. And also the woman I talked about, she is currently in Russia, allegedly, and hasn't been arrested. If she was involved in this Nord Stream affair, she would already be in prison in Russia, because you can go in prison for Russia for almost nothing at the moment. Yeah. So it's probably it's still bad research which is being done, but it's being how do you call that? It's being reused again, revived again. And it's very bad for Ukraine. It's very bad for the mutual support for Ukraine, because nobody really dives into the possibility, is it really feasible from this very little yacht in bad weather conditions, diving so deep in a very cold and rough sea with very heavy equipment? Can't be done.
Right. I mean, my next question would be, is this going to hurt Ukraine support a story like this, or is it not really strong enough?
Well, the damage is already being done. A lot of people just take this story and say, okay, we have to stop the help to Ukraine. We see that in Germany, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is a very right-wing party, is against support for Ukraine. And there are local elections next month, I know, in Eastern Germany, and probably the AfD will win. So if this movement becomes bigger and bigger, it might put a bomb under the support to Ukraine. Also, the discussions in the German government about the bottom of the government funding is there, and only current and signed up financial help for Ukraine will continue, and not new help. And also in the Netherlands, with the right-wing party, there were questions asked from, should we still prolong our help to Ukraine now that this is happening? Well, nothing new is happening. Let me be clear on that. It's regenerated old news in order to help the Russians. And the more this is being talked about, the more Putin will laugh.
Yeah. No, okay. So let's not talk about it anymore. We'll go. We have a couple minutes left. So everyone in the chat, ask your last questions if you have any. Also, some more questions are off topic. So we have one question off topic, Patrick, that BGC Vieten asked. Thank you very much. And he asked, do the Dutch have a prefix like HMS for your ships? Do we? Do you know?
Yes.
Yes.
ZMS, Zijne Majesteit, His Majesty.
Ah.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, I didn't even know that. I'm from the Netherlands too, but I had no idea that we did.
No, every kingdom, I guess, has that for its naval vessels.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question. I'm just going to go for some chat questions. What is Geert Wilders' stance on all this? Do we on Ukraine and everything? Because I think that's expanding on what you were explaining earlier.
Yeah. Officially, Geert Wilders' party, PVV, which is a party without members, because Geert Wilders is the only member. And you might ask questions about the democratic value of this party, but that's not an issue. Formally, he's part of the government, and in the government policy, long-during support for Ukraine is being written down. But we all know Geert Wilders, he's always probing and trying to get his way, and he asked very critical questions. Of course, everybody's allowed to do that, but we all know what's behind those critical questions. But formally, his party is supporting Ukraine, and
Okay.
let's keep it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Then another question around your specialty, Patrick. You talked about specialty in space domain and drone warfare. We talked a little bit about that already. And maybe to specify, like manned drones, they still have an operator working behind a manned drone, for example. But is there development with AI-driven drones, or basically what is the future in that whole area?
Okay.
Yeah.
A manned drone is very confusing because drones are always unmanned systems.
Right.
That doesn't mean there's no man in the loop. There's still always a man in the loop for drone systems the Netherlands uses, for example. We say that the Reaper MQ-9 drone, which is a very big drone and can carry weapons as well, but is being used for reconnaissance, is an aircraft where the pilot isn't in the aircraft but sitting in a container and in another location. So within our government policy, drones are still managed by people. There's always a man in the loop, but of course there's this tendency to use artificial intelligence.
Right.
Drones can be tampered with in the electronic warfare domain, disturbed the communication between the pilot and the ground and the system itself in the air can be disturbed by electromagnetic waves. But if you still want your drone to do what it's being programmed to do, you have to put in artificial intelligence to make sure that the drone can make decisions on its own in order to fulfill its task, which has been set by the operator on the ground. But also in other fields, for example, in air defense, where we might have to use artificial intelligence if you're overwhelmed by a swarm of drones, which is also artificial intelligence commandeered. Probably you also need artificial intelligence to make the best decisions in which is the biggest threat, which weapon should I use against that threat, and how can I keep myself as safe as possible. So it's a trend which absolutely will increase the use of artificial intelligence, but we still have the moral and ethical value that when you have a drone which you can use in order to kill people, there must always be a man in the loop.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense too. I know we're on the dot, right, Patrick? I know you have your evening to enjoy. Maybe before we end, maybe quickly show everyone again that's on the call your book that you contributed a couple chapters to. So, like I said earlier, Reflections on the Russian-Ukraine War. Check it out if you're interested, everyone here. And you wrote, Patrick, 2 chapters, was it? Or 3 chapters? Or
no, one chapter together with Professor Dr. Lonneke Peperkamp, and that's only about the use of the space domain in the Ukraine war. What did we see? How is it being used? And also how civil commercial partners are becoming part of the war, especially in the space domain. In the first day of the war, everybody still remembers those images of this 60 kilometers traffic jam going from Russia into Ukraine, close to Kiev. And those images weren't made by military satellites. They were made by Planet Lab and Maxar. And these are commercial firms. And also Starlink by Elon Musk, SpaceX company. The Starlink satellite communication system was essential for Ukraine in order to maintain their command and control, their overview and command from the central command in Kiev to all the units, and Starlink was really essential in that. But also, we know the stories that Starlink was shut off when Ukraine wanted to attack the Crimea. So here's how you see how commercial players can influence the war, even though they're not part of the war or not part of the fighting factions.
Right. I mean, I know we just quit, but it would be very last comment on that, actually. The Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink, for example, I find it interesting because Elon's getting a lot of hate from the EU lately, and there's a lot of, problems, which is fine. But he's been vital to the war effort, hasn't he? Or how do you see that?
Sorry,
he's been vital to the war effort.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You're right, and that was very generous of him, also. But he's also a very strange guy, and he threatened to cut off the whole Starlink situation because he wasn't paid for it, and that means if you want to do if you want to partner up with commercial civilian firms, and you're in a war, you really have to think about what are the dangers I'm entering, what are the risks, how can I mitigate those risks? And we enter a whole new field of warfare in this issue here.
Yeah, no, I see that too. I see it too. It's a difficult situation.
But I think the fight between the EU and Elon Musk was more about Twitter. It was. And not so much on Starlink.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just thought it's interesting. We always, we bash Elon Musk a lot, but then again, you have to give credit where credit is due to, I guess.
He created dependability. He's like a hard drugs dealer.
Yeah.
First, you become dependent on him, and then you have to pay.
Yeah. That's also a way of doing business. Yeah. Patrick, thank you. I mean, everyone in the comments was very positive. So thank Patrick, everyone. It was great to have you on. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And everyone. So next live stream is next week on Wednesday. We have it every Wednesday from now on. And if you like the work we do, consider Patreon. And of course, if you want to read more about this, check out Patrick's book. And everyone, have a great evening. Patrick, thank you. And until